also a director of a company, Resilience Ltd. So he'll talk to us exactly about this, the WES, a podcast intervention in the children's mental health crisis. And I'll say no more, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fleur. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I'd like to just begin by extending a special thanks to Arnaud, Fleur, and Marie-Eva for putting together such a wonderful event, and also for allowing me to present in my first language, and for organizing so much of this conference to be in English. I'm very, very grateful for that. My slides, I've done a French translation, and everything I say is in the notes on those slides, which have been translated into French, which Fleur and Marie-Eva have. Today I'm going to offer some key points into a journey that I took into native podcasting that began in 2014 and led me to produce a book and quite a successful high-impact science fiction adventure drama podcast for kids. It was a project that was particularly dependent on research into native podcasting traits.
To the right. Yes, so maybe here.
Okay.
Oh, it's not working.
So,
Technical glitch.
technical
Okay.
difficulties. Please stand by.
Yes,
Okay,
so it's
so what I
here with a hardware.
That one very hard. Got it. Okay. That project has been a thoroughly collaborative one from the beginning, and I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the main people involved. So as Fleur said, I'm Martin Spinelli. I'm the first professor of podcasting in the UK. I'm the lead author on the first scholarly monograph on podcasting as a new medium, and the lead editor of the Bloomsbury Podcast Studies book series, which Richard and John are also involved with on the editorial board. I'm also a director of the company Resilience Limited. My research and creative partner, Lance Dan, he's the one on the right on the slide. He is the other director of Resilience Limited, and he's a senior lecturer in digital media at the University of Brighton with a long track record in winning very prestigious national and international awards for audio. He's done numerous projects for the BBC, for Audible, and for other outlets. And he and I have worked equally on everything that I'm going to present to you today. And Resilience Limited is our independent children's media company. Through it, we do high impact, high distribution, research-based projects with a pro-social well-being and mental health emphasis. The two people in the photo on the left are Hannah Barry and Tim Pilcher. They're the other two people formerly involved with Resilience Limited, and that photo is of them at the recent British Podcasting Awards that happened in London a couple of months ago. The project that I'm going to share with you today is a highly integrated transmedia undertaking called The Res. The Res is a podcast-centric project, but it has other indispensable components: a series of comic books, a website, an app, which we're currently developing, as well as things like lesson plans. And I'll talk more about all of those later in the presentation. I hope to share some potentially useful observations to anyone here working at the intersection of academic research and media production, and intending to have a sizable audience with a real-world impact. We're all working in a relatively new field, certainly compared to other media, and routes through it, particularly routes through it to impact, can be a bit murky, a bit muddy, a bit foggy, even at the best of times. So here today in this presentation, I am going to talk to you about our background research into podcasting, the mental health context of the RES project, the native podcasting traits that we sought to develop and mobilize and make the most of, the reach, distribution, and impact of the RES, our qualitative and quantitative research data and the findings we synthesized from them, the importance of integration, and that's really my key takeaway today, how we finance the project, and a model or a template that we synthesized for this work, for ourselves going forward. We began our research into the native characteristics and methods of podcasting just after the podcast Serial launched and was setting the world alight in 2014. Several of us already this morning have mentioned Serial and that Serial moment. That was the moment in which podcasting, at least in the US, really burst into the mainstream public consciousness. And even to this day, we're still feeling the reverberations of that Serial moment in the surfeit of true crime podcasts, which are certainly one of the most popular, if not the most popular, genres in the medium. We realized that at that formational moment in 2014, the networks we had in the professional audio world, I had worked for National Public Radio, Lance had worked for the BBC. Through those networks that we had in the professional audio making world, we had the chance to interview virtually all of the large players working in the podcast space in the UK and in the US at that time. And this is certainly not something that we or anybody else could do today. Things have moved on that quickly. We spoke to the creators and presenters of WNYC's Radio Lab, the producers of Serial, the team behind My Dad Wrote a Porno, who Richard mentioned earlier, the senior management of the BBC who were then overseeing their podcasting initiatives, the creators of Gimlet Media, the creators of Welcome to Night Vale, which has also come up at least once today, the executive producer of Radiotopia, and several others, as well as some early high-profile critics and reviewers of the forum. We synthesized all these findings into a book about the distinctive traits of podcasting, that which differentiates it from audio media before it. The book was called Podcasting: The Audio Media Revolution, which came out in 2019. It's been quite important and is now in its 6th printing. It was the first book in what has become the Bloomsbury Podcast Studies series, which I mentioned earlier. We are soliciting manuscripts for good academic, scholarly, and practical analyses of podcasting. If anybody has any ideas that they'd like to talk about while we're here today or tomorrow, you can have a word with me or John Sullivan or Richard Barry. As we were winding down the research for that book, we were becoming aware of a larger social issue that was happening all around us and had its possible roots in digital media. That issue was the spiking mental health crisis among adolescents. This is something that was personally affecting us and our families and people that we knew on both sides of the Atlantic. The graph on the right points to major depressive episodes in young people more than doubling over the span of 8 years. The Children's Society in the UK finds that more than half of the young people in the UK have experienced a significant worsening of their mental health in the past 5 years. 3 years ago, the World Health Organization found that 13% of the diseases reported by 10 to 19-year-olds were now mental health diseases. Obviously, the COVID pandemic exacerbated the problem and made things much worse. The head of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK called the situation a crisis on top of a crisis. Parents are also obviously troubled by this, and they're engaging with this information and doing their own homework. The Pew Research Center found last year that 7 out of 10 parents now place some of the blame for the situation at the foot of digital devices and the media that their kids consume through those devices. So after engaging with a tremendous amount of data around this crisis and reflecting on the reality and the likely permanence of mobile devices in all our lives, Lance and I paused to ask some questions. Might there be a better way? Might there be a better use for digital media on digital devices that isn't so potentially harmful? And crucially for us, might podcasting, something that is principally oral, be a part of a potential response to that crisis? So we decided to take some of the things that we discovered about the traits of podcasting from our research and attempt a real-world test of what podcasting might be able to do in addressing the problem. The first traits that we focused on were something that's already come up a couple of times today, the distinctively intimate quality of podcasting. Part of this has to do with the mechanism of delivery. On headphones and with earbuds, characters and presenters are literally in our ears. They're literally in our own bodies. A very, very intimate way of connecting and making meaning. Freeman in 2019 found that 45% of podcast listening was done on headphones or earbuds, and that number has continued to rise since. Most of the ambitious producers that we spoke to over the course of doing the research for the book recognized this intimacy very, very quickly and started to produce with that characteristic in mind. And the most common approach that they took to this was the form of direct personal address to an individual listener in a way that was qualitatively different than was happening previously on radio. This understanding often leads to the creation of a device being built into stories. In the res, this device was an ancient hacked phone that allowed the characters in the story to communicate with the real kids of the past, our actual listeners in the 2020s. And this is going to come up later in the presentation. The second trait, following on the first, was that this approach of direct address fosters parasocial relationships, a sense that a listener has a connection with a character or a presenter that is not just someone like me, but that is someone who might potentially be my friend. These relationships might be one way or one directional, but they are very, very real nonetheless. The third trait was the age of the general podcast audience. According to Pew Research, this should be surprising to no one, 48% of the total podcast audience in the US are under 30, 59% of US high school students have listened to at least one podcast in the past year. And they're also extremely engaged with the cultural content that they like and cultural content that they consume. They had a strong affinity for and attachment to the podcasts that they followed, the same way that some people have with video streamers as well. They buy t-shirts, they buy merch, they go to gigs, they go to performances, they create fan art, they find each other online, and they become part of a community. In the case of the res, we found that community forming in listener comments on our feeds, where the kids who were likely too young to have social media accounts of their own would have dialogues and conversations in the comment threads on each of the episodes that we would put on our feeds, which was quite a lovely thing to observe and something that we didn't expect to begin with. Finally, the last trait I want to point to is that podcasts are a mobile medium. Edison Research, who has been doing systematic quantitative data analysis of the podcast audience for as long as podcasting has been a thing, find that 51% of podcast listening in the US occurs outside of the home. And that is a figure that's catching up in the UK as well. People listen in cars, people listen on trains, people listen as they exercise. This is an audience that is going places and doing things. They might not be like Brandon Baker's ideal listener that was mentioned on the previous slide. They're doing things while they listen, and podcasts are integrated into their everyday lives. So the material we produce has to consider, or should consider, that tension between mobility and intimacy, the tension between complementary activity and strong relationships. Something that we also noticed, and something that gave us quite a bit of hope at the beginning of this project, was how many people were already using podcasts to support their mental health in ad hoc ways. There were a large number of podcasts intended or just incidentally shoring up well-being. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, audiences used podcasts for companionship, to give them support, to feel connected to other people like themselves, even if they never meet in real life. This is particularly true of podcasts intended for teen audiences, we found. For example, the gently comedic and surreal American horror podcast, Welcome to Night Vale, which we've already talked about, and is featured on this slide, is a really kind of great example of that. In Night Vale, on the surface, the episodes are strange and dark and vaguely conspiratorial and vaguely dystopian. It offers a world where all conspiracy theories are in fact true, but everybody just gets on with their lives and carries on with that information in the back of their mind. Several articles have been written about Night Vale in fandom studies about how teens form communities, found companionship and support through different kinds of engagement with Night Vale. And this made it a really, really good and interesting reference point for us as we embarked on producing the res. So after noting all this, and after deciding that we wanted something that was much more intentional, much more research-based and systematic in its approach, in our efforts to create a podcast designed to make a dent in the adolescent mental health crisis, the first person we reached out to is this chap, Robin Banerjee. He was, when we worked with him on the project, the head of psychology at the University of Sussex. He's also the founder of the CRESS Lab. CRESS stands for Children's Resilience, Emotions, and Social Skills. He's informally known as the Professor of Kindness, and he's now director of the Center for Research on Kindness, which is also at the University of Sussex. His most well-known research focuses specifically on children's media diets, and on how those diets affect children's values, and how those values then go on to affect their long-term mental health and well-being. Robin discovered that what he calls intrinsic media diets, so diets that are pointed at self-development, achieving personal potential, health, community, and belonging, were mentally healthier in the long term than what he describes as extrinsic media diets, diets that are pointed at fame, at social status, at image, and at material possession and acquisition. So in a nutshell, his work demonstrates that if young people are other-directed, their mental health outcomes over time will likely be better. And if they're focused on what the CRESS Lab calls consumer culture ideals, their mental health outcomes over time will likely be worse. Also, and very appealing to my work and to Lance's work, More broadly, Robin's research finds that empathy is a trait of high well-being teens, and that diets rich in well-crafted stories help young people develop empathy, and not just any stories, but particularly interesting in this context, in a school of journalism, more fiction stories than nonfiction stories were a kind of connected to in some way empathy. So we took Robin's research, we took what we discovered ourselves about podcasting traits, intimacy, parasocial relationships, committed younger audience, mobile media, etc. And we developed The Res. The Res is a sci-fi adventure drama for 7 to 11-year-olds that's built on the latest research into kindness and media diets. To begin the narrative of the project, the story, to start working on that, we set up this very shiny and seemingly perfect world where all of those bad, extrinsic consumer culture ideals were celebrated and amplified. In the world of The Res, at least when the story begins, there's the gamification of everything, relentless competition and comparison, changing your body image every day to keep up with the latest trends, hyper consumption and retail therapy, and a constant pursuit of likes and followers in the future version of social media. And then we dropped into that world a pair of unlikely friends who start to scratch at that tiny surface, at that shiny surface, at that the perfection of that utopian, dystopian world, and they begin to ask questions like, why is nobody really happy when we can download everything? What is real friendship? Is there something more than what we're being offered, etc.? We then developed a story device, like I mentioned earlier, a hacked old phone that allows our heroes to actually speak with and communicate with the real kids of the 2020s. These were kids that we interviewed and asked about things like kindness and friendship and bullying and how to patch things up after a fight and how to make the world better. In the series, our listeners actually hear contemporary kids like themselves giving advice to our two heroes, Green and Sav. Everything we did here was very much what we call practice-led research. We had some hypotheses. We were exploring them and testing them in a real-world podcast ecosystem to see what would have purchase, to see what would work. We also devised some mechanisms in the project that we built in to gauge the effectiveness further down the line, and I will talk to you a bit more about those in a few slides. To make these experiments viable and really properly useful and to invite the impact that we were hoping for, we knew we had to produce something that was not just worthy, not just something that was good for you, but also something that was genuinely appealing and popular. One of our initial ideas for making that work was getting some extremely professional, well-known actors to be a part of the project as a means to that end of making it popular. Our cast included Emily Burnett, who was a children's BAFTA winner and one of the stars of the British TV show Hollyoaks, Carl Queensborough, who, when we were recording, was the star of the show Hamilton on the West End in London. BAFTA winner Juliet Aubrey, who plays our baddie, Jeff, the AI, and Nathan Bryant, who is a children's writer and a rising TV star in both kids and adults TV in the UK. Our team of writers was led by Hannah Barry, who was then the UK Comics Laureate. It also included best-selling authors and award-winning writers for the BBC and ITV in the UK. The first episode of The Res came out in the spring of 2021, and since then we've had more than 500,000 downloads. We started in the top 20 kids charts in the US and the UK, and we've been the #1 podcast across all categories in several smaller countries. And I'm very happy to say that The Res has become one of the most popular children's podcast dramas internationally. So a high quality and well-known cast and crew were important, but we think that even more importantly for our success, an even bigger factor, was our relationship with our distributor. Our distributor is the American-based Gen Z Media. Gen Z were a trailblazer in the world of kids podcasting. They staked a claim to that space very, very early. They are the largest producer of kids audio content in the world, and they make the two most listened to kids podcasts in the world. The first one being Mars Patel, and the second one being 6 Minutes. Mars Patel launched in 2016 and was really the first big kids podcast. It won a Peabody Award and has been the top kids podcast for many years. Gen Z followed that up with 6 Minutes, which has been even more popular, and last year was downloaded 30 million times, which is really, really huge. Gen Z are really protective of their brand. So the Res, our project, was the first project in their portfolio of programs produced outside of their company. What's important here is that because Gen Z have been around for a very long time, parents trust their content. Being promoted by them and having our episodes dropped in the feeds of their other very, very popular shows has meant a huge boon to our listening numbers. It's also worth noting that being based in the UK with a set of British cultural reference points as we are, but also working very closely with an American distributor, that situation has given us some extremely valuable insight into upcoming trends in podcasting in the UK, and I also believe in Europe. In podcast formats, genres, and technology, the US is roughly about 5 years ahead of where we are in the UK. And being kind of in both worlds has been really, really useful in our company's planning, thinking about what trends might be coming down the podcast pike, as it were. And I'm going to share some of those insights into that relationship later in the talk. So that's a very, very quick, breezy thumbnail sketch of how the Res was developed and launched. Now I'd like to distill some of our findings from the data that we derived from it. Part of our website of games and resources and bonus content also includes an online survey where we collected more than 1,000 responses from respondents who engaged differently with our initial main components. So these are components that are all integrated into a larger amalgamated experience of the Res. Those three components or three media forms were the podcast, which is the central item. There are 25 episodes of roughly 15 minutes each across 2 seasons. The comic, we've issued 2 comic books, one that tracks the story of the first episode of season 1, and another that provides backstory into the characters and the world. The third main component is the website, which contains bonus content, messages from our pastlings. Those are the real kids that we interviewed in the 2020s that communicate with our characters, messages from our characters, news from the story world, fun and funny games that are derived from events in the story, like Fart Cow Blaster and Monkey Mayhem, and things that 10-year-olds find really appealing. All 3 of these components of the Res project, these 3 different media forms, shored up in different ways and developed in different ways the kindness, pro-social, resilience, and mental health messaging that we got from our psychology consultants like Robin Banerjee. The quantitative data that I'm going to show you on the next slide speaks to how well these messages were absorbed and to what extent they were taken on board by our audience. We asked our respondents in the survey to reflect on how their exposure to the Res affected their understanding of certain things. The questions on our survey about messaging are organized into 4 rubrics or 4 metrics: happiness, confidence, connection, and kindness. This infographic on the screen now compares the message absorption across those different media forms, those different iterations of the project. There are users who primarily engaged with the podcasts. We compared them to users who primarily engaged with comic, and we compared them with users who primarily engaged with the website. You can see that the users who primarily engaged with the podcast had the highest increase in the connection matrix here. Those are the orange bars. Primary comic users showed the greatest gains on the kindness and the confidence metrics. The primary website users showed the greatest gains in our happiness matrix. And if, most interestingly and most importantly, if you were a significant engager of all 3 of those components, you showed the greatest gains in understanding of the messages across the board. And that's the grouping on the top. These are the people who responded to our survey, who engaged with all 3 of those forms: the podcast, the comic, and the website. These are some takeaways from the data analysis that we had done. The audio podcast, as we expected, and as has been demonstrated in other historical studies, showed the most potential for fostering a sense of connection. A higher level finding was that one media was a gateway into other media forms. Once that happened, the message absorption was the best. Those messages were taken on board to the greatest degree. So put another way, 36% of our respondents, that group on the top of the previous slide, engaged with all 3 of our main media components. If they found one component of the res, more than 1/3 of our total engagers were drawn to those other 2 forms where the impact was the greatest. The survey provided insight into our native audience, who were mostly North American and mostly bunched in large urban centers. But obviously children who discover and choose to listen to a podcast about kindness are going to be predisposed to respond well to messages about kindness from a podcast, and have other quite specific demographic markers that we can assume. So we were interested in finding more about what we called our non-native audience, so people who found us unprompted. So to generate this, to engage with this audience, we created lesson plans, which were approved by the PSHE Association, Personal Social Health and Economics Association, which is a primary school subject in the national curriculum in the UK. And we had lots of uptake across the country and across the world with those lesson plans. We used that lesson plan outreach to identify people who are using, to kind of invite schools to use our material. We then went into those schools and did some workshops, fun, creative workshops. We interviewed the children who had been exposed to those lesson plans in classes, introduced to the res, and talked to the teachers who were delivering that content as well. Some of the things that we found coming out of those workshops were perhaps not surprising. Only 5% of the students that we talked to could name a podcast before they listened to the res, so not a huge awareness of podcasts before that. For many of them, podcast listening was a complementary activity. They would listen to our podcast while they did homework, while they played games on the computer, while they read comics. our audio podcast was a kind of springboard into their own mental creativity to create things and scenes and play with characters in their minds. In one instance, a school that we sent T-shirts and stickers to, the kids there formed their own res club in the playground where they made up games, which was all really, really nice and interesting. Another key takeaway was that the characters that they remembered the most were not like the weirdest, wildest ones from this future world. They were characters that they had some connection with already in their lives. So this is a character on the screen, Sav's grandmother. She's a kind of kooky inventor, very minor character in the story, but the kids really, really responded to her very, very well. Jessica Fisher, who is the director of digital marketing for Gen Z Media, has been really, really pushing schools as a route to maximizing users and to getting high engagement listeners. Now, Gen Z Media, every year, this is something that was born out of the pandemic where they saw a huge boom in their uptake in schools. They are actively going out and trying to do what we're doing, which is creating additional bonus educational content for teachers to use. They also do a weekly Zoom with a class somewhere in the US where one of their creators will come and talk to the kids on Zoom about one of their projects. This has been really, really huge for them. On the next couple of slides, I've got some information on the project financing, how we finance the project. So I thought this information would be particularly useful for people who might be thinking about similar grant-funded undertakings that straddle the university world and the private media production company world. This pie chart looks at our grant money. It's the money that we got in the grants and specifically allocated to different categories. It's the money that we originally budgeted. There were some other smaller grants that I haven't tallied up in here, but you could see it would be a mistake to think about budgeting just for a series of audio podcasts. Our podcasts are the key component, but they are integrated into other components of a much larger undertaking. This chart does not show our in-kind contributions. This one is a chart that shows our in-kind contributions, which is largely my research time and Lance's research time, essentially donated by our universities to the project. This chart is a much more realistic example of what you are going to have to invest if you're going to do a project like this on your own outside of a university context. And you'll see the management slice that was only 4.5% on the previous slide has now become the largest slice at over 40%. So that is really something to keep in mind. I'm going to just whip ahead to our model, and I'll wrap things up in the next few minutes before we take some questions. So the res, as I said, was a prototype. It was a test. We did this thing, threw it out in the world, wanted to see what it would do, how people would respond, what the reaction would be. We also wanted to figure out for our own research interest as academics, but also as in our own commercial media production world, what's going to work the best and what's going to be the most efficient. So in the course of doing this project, we put together a list of 10 points that we are using going forward, and I hope will also be of interest to you. And I know that most of you here exist in a journalism space, and this project is a drama. However, especially if you're using kids or working with kids, there's a lot of information here that's going to be quite useful to you if you want to take these projects and run with them yourselves. So number one, integration is really the key thing. Transmedia experiences. Think about putting lots of different things together, not just a podcast. Integrate kids' contemporary concerns and everyday life. Think family life, think social life, think school life, think gaming. Co-creation workshops we found were really, really useful in this. This is a photo from a co-creation workshop we did with kids in Leicester. Part of this is also connecting with teachers that are a great source for issues of the day, which you can then build into your narrative, but also a really good, they're really good promoters of your work, a really good distribution channel. Number two, think highly targeted and niche. Know your audience really, really well, and be very clear about the problem or issue you want to address or the impact you want to have. Our company, Resilience, is currently developing shows about aging and dying for preteens, and a show about sex and identity in Shakespeare for high school students who are studying literature. Number three, remember that listening is intimate. Think family time, think bedtime. We see this happening in the US market a lot, with a whole slate of new shows designed for, perhaps sadly designed for, listening at bedtime. So listening as a substitute for reading to children in bed. Number four, for characters, use relationships that the kids are familiar with already. Kids that they already have, characters that they already have some association with, relatives, family, school friends. This is going to enable the formation of those relationships that we are so keen on. Number five, as Gen Z reminds us a lot, schools are the route to big audiences. So think about producing educational support materials and building school connections. Number six, podcasts can provide direct and powerful connections with your audience if you talk directly to them, if you talk straight to them. Talk straight to them, draw them into your world, they will feel a part of it, they'll respond. And again, this activates those parasocial relationships that are really, really key to high engagement. Number seven, creating and producing the res took a tremendous amount of time because it was narratively and sonically quite complex. As we, as a company, move more and more into the commercial space, where being cost effective is more important, we're leaning into leaner projects and leaner formats. So be creative within clearly defined, easily reproduced formats. There's a lot of fun to be had in lean formats and working to precise parameters. Number eight, brand loyalty is really strong. We believe this is a really, really key point, even more for parents than for kids. Unlike the world of social media, parents are making most of the listening choices we found for children. So if parents trust your distributor, the distributor you're on, they will trust your project. Number nine, on that note, we found that initially we'd overinvested in social media, that kids' use of social media is very mercurial, very fragmented, very inconsistent. They also, particularly for the age group of our cohort, shouldn't be on social media anyway, shouldn't have social media accounts. So lean into pre-existing networks. For us, it was our distributor GZM and the PSHE Association in the UK. And then finally, number 10, don't rely on advertising to fund projects like this, or to fund, frankly, any podcast. When we're thinking about funding children's podcasts, unless we have a big celebrity attached, unless we have a unicorn, we're just not going to earn enough through advertising to fund things. There are much better ways to fund your podcast. We're looking at sponsorship arrangements with companies that share our ethos and our values. We're developing podcasts for other mental health and children's health agencies. We're continuing to pursue grants. So as you saw on the previous slide, we did the res with about 200,000 of grant money. Money goes a lot further in podcasts than it does on screen. We're also looking to develop our own IP, license our IP, which is popular to other larger media companies to take it forward into other iterations. That's all I have for you today. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully you found that interesting. And if you want me, please reach out to me there. Okay. I'm sure we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this conference. So we will be taking questions. I just have maybe a first one to begin with. You've been talking at the start of your paper about media diets. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that And also, if you've met some criticism about the res, the criticism being kids are too much in front of screens. Some people say podcast is a way away from screen, but actually it is, you need to access the podcast through the screen, so it is not. So have you met this kind of bad phase, if I can?
So yes, there is definitely pushback. Oh, you're just creating more digital media. Interestingly, when that criticism comes up, we refer to the Pew Research research done into this, and they find that parents, the overwhelming majority of parents, do not consider listening to podcasts screen time. So in the minds of parents, at least, podcasts do not fall foul of that. And yes, you have to kind of engage with them through an app. However, because they are things that are consumed alongside of in a complementary way with lots of other activities, the screen is not essential to their experience.
And also, what is IP?
Oh, IP is intellectual property.
Okay.
So our copyright on the res world. So Lance and I developed the world of the res and the character of the res outside of our university work. We're both part-time, which gives us some freedom to sort of claim some of the work that we do on the outside. Oh, and you mentioned media diets. So media diets, it's a very, very useful and interesting term. It refers to the kinds of media and the forms of media that people consume.
I thought it was stop using media as kind of like doing a diet.
No. It's like we all have diets. It's a healthy diet or an unhealthy diet. Okay. And there are healthy media diets and there are unhealthy media diets. Thank you for that clarification.
Okay, I've got a question. It's a very great example of applied research, and congratulations for that. But I have a question about the obstacle you encounter on the university, for instance, for this kind of project. Was it easy, or was it a long road of obstacles coming from your hierarchy, from the university, from your colleagues? I don't know.
There is a lot. There is a lot of pushback from. The word I will use is more conventional scholars for this kind of work. It's important for our own positions, Lance and my position in our universities, that we are also academics. So we publish books, we publish articles, we have the American expression is street cred in that world. The wrinkle that has occurred in the UK that has benefited us is there is a push. It's in the minds of a lot of people, and I also agree, a neoliberal push in the world of higher education in the UK to make everything about impact. We're moving away from the idea of research for research's sake, knowledge for knowledge's sake, which I think is a terrible shame. However, there are large pots of cash that you can access now if you want to work in impact. So we just decided, rather than fighting with people at university senate meetings, let's just grab the cash and do something good with it, which is what we've done.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you. I also have a question on Zoom from Coraline, who's asking if you could tell us more about your business model, and was it between financing and mediatization?
Okay, so our business model now is in flux. I am not a business person, but what we are doing is we are producing children's media now for other entities and agencies who want to have some media, some children's media, particularly a podcasting front. So podcasting, as we have said several times today, is cool, is hip, is sexy, is trendy, something that we wouldn't have said 15 or 20 years ago about podcasting. All of these things are now true. Everybody, every government agency, every company in the UK, it seems to me, wants a podcast. So we are well positioned to help those companies deliver those podcasts to kids. So we are working with a bereavement charity in the southeast of England to do this project about aging and dying for young people. We are looking to do something with the NHS around children's mental health, NHS, the National Health Service in the UK. We have also gotten a big grant to do a commercial app, an app that we will sell a subscription to as a bolt-on to one of our other children's well-being projects. So I guess the direct answer to that question from the person on Zoom, thank you, Caroline, is that in the short term, we are still going for grants, and we're still funding ourselves largely through grants. These are grants now, not just from the university, but also outside of the university through the UK Research Institute, as we begin to figure out ways to fund podcasts that don't involve apps. I suspect for the next 10 years at least, we're always going to be working with larger companies, with larger charities that have budgets who want podcasts, because frankly, it's very, very hard to sell podcasts. In a sea of infinite audio content, there's very little reason to buy things.
Thank you. We may have time for one final question.
Thank you, great presentation. Fantastic project. I just wonder if when you were talking to kids, and I assume that's kind of an ongoing process, what you find their reaction is to the act of listening. Now, are they happy to listen, or do they need a sort of a visual stimulus as well as the auditory?
So interestingly, in the schools that we talk to, something that I can describe as an unmitigated failure is trying to get kids to listen in a group in a classroom. As I'm sure we've all experienced, to university students, every time you try to play them something, the 10-year-olds get distracted by other 10-year-olds very, very easily. So getting them to focus in on an audio-only experience is very, very hard. The comic books really do help with that. A lot of the kids who picked up the podcast off the back of being exposed to it in schools are listening on their way to and from school. So they're listening while they commute, which is not a screen-based experience. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Martin, for this beautiful conference.
My pleasure. Thank you all.